The year was 1929, and archaeologist Claude Schaefer's spade struck something extraordinary in the ancient ruins of Ras Shamra, Syria. What he uncovered would shatter everything historians thought they knew about the origins of one of the world's most influential religious concepts. Hidden beneath centuries of sand and stone lay thousands of clay tablets, written in a language that had been lost to time for over 3 millennia. But it wasn't just any language. These tablets contained the name that would become sacred to billions: Yahweh. The shocking revelation? These weren't Hebrew tablets, and they weren't written by the ancestors of Israel. They were centuries older, crafted by a completely different civilization that worshipped Yahweh long before the first Hebrew ever uttered a prayer. For decades, scholars had believed they understood the timeline of monotheistic worship. The story seemed clear. Abraham received his calling around 2000 BCE, Moses encountered the burning bush around 1300 BCE, and from there, the worship of Yahweh spread through the Hebrew people and eventually to the world. But those ancient tablets from Ugarit told a radically different story, one that religious institutions weren't eager to discuss and that most history books conveniently overlooked. The tablets revealed that Yahweh wasn't just known to the ancient Canaanites. He was actively worshipped by them as part of a complex pantheon of gods, centuries before Israel existed as a nation. The implications were staggering. If the Canaanites knew and worshipped Yahweh before the Hebrews, then where did this divine name really originate? Who were the first people to call upon Yahweh? And why has this crucial chapter of religious history been buried for so long? Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we excavate the hidden truths of human history. I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it there? Are you a student diving deep into research, a professional taking a break, or perhaps someone whose faith journey has led them to question the origins of belief itself? Drop your location, time, and profession in the comments. I love seeing our global community of truth seekers come together. To understand how revolutionary these Ugaritic discoveries were, we need to transport ourselves back to the world of the Late Bronze Age, around 1500 to 1200 BCE. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean as a bustling network of trade routes, where merchants carried not just goods, but ideas, stories, and gods across vast distances. The city of Ugarit sat perfectly positioned on this ancient superhighway, its harbors welcoming ships from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and beyond. The people of Ugarit weren't primitive pastoral nomads. They were sophisticated urbanites who developed one of the world's first alphabetic writing systems. Their libraries contained administrative records, literary epics, and, most importantly for our story, detailed religious texts that painted a vivid picture of their spiritual world. And in this world, Yahweh had a very specific role that would surprise anyone familiar with later Hebrew theology. In the Ugaritic pantheon, Yahweh wasn't the supreme creator god. That position belonged to El, whose name literally means God, and who served as the father figure of the divine assembly. Below El were various specialized deities. Baal controlled storms and fertility, Asherah served as the mother goddess, and Mot ruled over death and the underworld. But Yahweh? The tablets reveal him as a warrior god associated with the southern desert regions, a deity of storms and warfare who rode upon the clouds and commanded the forces of nature in battle. This portrait of Yahweh as one god among many, rather than the one true God, sent shockwaves through theological circles when it was first deciphered. Here was clear evidence that the name Yahweh existed in religious consciousness long before Moses reportedly encountered him at Mount Sinai. But the story gets even more intriguing when we examine exactly how the Ugaritians viewed this desert god. The Ugaritic texts describe Yahweh using epithets that would later become central to Hebrew worship. He's called Rider of the Clouds, a title that appears almost word for word in several biblical psalms. He's associated with mountains, storms, and divine warfare, all characteristics that Hebrew scriptures would later attribute to their national god. Most remarkably, some Ugaritic texts seem to describe Yahweh as having a consort, the goddess Asherah, who is also mentioned throughout Hebrew scriptures, though usually in the context of being rejected or destroyed by Hebrew reformers. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. The Ugaritic tablets weren't just isolated evidence of pre-Hebrew Yahweh worship. As archaeologists continued digging throughout the 20th century, similar evidence began surfacing across the ancient Near East. In Egypt, temple inscriptions mentioned a group called the Shasu, who worshipped Yahweh of the Southlands. These Shasu people were described as nomadic tribes from the desert regions south and east of Egypt, precisely the areas where Hebrew tradition places the early wanderings of Abraham and his descendants. Even more intriguing, Egyptian records from the reigns of Amenhotep III and Rameses II explicitly refer to Yahweh of the land of the Shasu Bedouin. These inscriptions date to the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, right around the traditional dating of the Hebrew exodus from Egypt. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether other peoples knew about Yahweh before Israel, but rather whether the early Hebrews learned about Yahweh from these other groups. Archaeological evidence began painting a picture that was both more complex and more fascinating than the traditional narrative. Excavations at sites throughout ancient Canaan revealed that many of the religious practices later associated with Hebrew worship, including the use of standing stones, specific types of altars, and even certain ritual formulas, were already well established among Canaanite peoples centuries before Hebrew settlement. This evidence forced scholars to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Rather than the Hebrews introducing monotheistic Yahweh worship to the region, they might have gradually adopted and transformed existing traditions about Yahweh that were already present among various Canaanite and nomadic groups. The transformation would have been remarkable, taking a regional storm and warrior god and elevating him to the status of universal creator and moral lawgiver. But the pre-Hebrew worship of Yahweh wasn't limited to the Levant. Tantalizing clues suggest that Yahweh's origins might reach back even further, into the mysterious realm of ancient Arabian religion. Some scholars point to connections between Yahweh and other ancient Semitic deities whose names share similar linguistic roots. The Arabic name Yahweh, meaning he who causes things to fall or happen, appears in pre-Islamic inscriptions. Ancient South Arabian texts reference deities with remarkably similar characteristics to those later attributed to Yahweh. Perhaps most intriguing of all are the possible connections to ancient Mesopotamian religion. Some researchers have identified potential links between Yahweh and certain aspects of the Mesopotamian storm god, Enlil, or even traced linguistic connections back to the ancient Sumerian pantheon. While these connections remain hotly debated, they raise the possibility that the divine name we now associate with Abrahamic monotheism might have incredibly ancient roots that extend back to the very dawn of human civilization. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond academic curiosity. If Yahweh was indeed worshipped by multiple peoples across the ancient Near East before the emergence of Hebrew religion, then the entire traditional narrative of divine revelation needs to be reconsidered. Were the Hebrew scriptures recording the moment when Yahweh first revealed himself to humanity? Or were they documenting how one particular people transformed and refined existing religious traditions into something revolutionary? Consider the profound theological questions this raises. If Abraham discovered Yahweh in Ur of the Chaldeans, was he actually encountering a God who was already known to his neighbors? When Moses met Yahweh at the burning bush, was this truly the first time this divine name had been spoken? Or was Moses tapping into a much older tradition of desert spirituality? And if the Israelites were commanded to destroy Canaanite religion, were they actually being told to eliminate competing versions of their own God's worship? The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the linguistic evolution of divine names throughout the ancient Near East. The Hebrew name Yahweh is traditionally understood to derive from the verb to be, suggesting a God who simply is, the eternal, self-existent one. But earlier Semitic languages contain variations of this root that carry slightly different meanings, often related to causing things to happen, bringing into existence, or manifesting in the world. This linguistic evidence suggests that the concept behind Yahweh might have evolved over centuries from a more concrete understanding of divine power, perhaps originally a God who manifested in storms and battles, into the more abstract, philosophical conception of pure being that we find in later Hebrew theology. If this evolution is accurate, then Hebrew religion's greatest achievement might not have been discovering Yahweh, but rather transforming the understanding of Yahweh from a regional deity into a universal principle. The transformation process appears to have been gradual and complex. Archaeological evidence from early Hebrew settlements shows that the Israelites initially worshipped Yahweh alongside other deities, much as their Canaanite neighbors did. Household shrines from the period of the Judges often contain figurines of Asherah alongside symbols associated with Yahweh. It was only later, during the period of the Hebrew monarchy, and especially during the religious reforms of kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, that Hebrew religion began insisting on exclusive worship of Yahweh alone. This historical progression makes sense of some of the more puzzling passages in Hebrew scripture, where Yahweh is described as superior to other gods rather than as the only God. Psalms like 82, where Yahweh is depicted as judging other members of a divine council, make much more sense when understood as reflecting an earlier period when Yahweh was seen as the most powerful among many gods, rather than as the only God in existence. The transformation of Yahweh from one God among many to the one true God represents one of the most significant religious developments in human history. But understanding this transformation requires acknowledging that it was indeed a transformation, an evolution of existing religious concepts rather than a sudden revelation from nothing. For many people of faith, these archaeological discoveries don't diminish the significance of their beliefs, but rather enhance them. Instead of seeing Yahweh as a tribal deity who happened to achieve global prominence, they see evidence of a divine presence that was working throughout human history, gradually revealing himself more clearly through various cultures and peoples, until that revelation reached its fullest expression in Hebrew monotheism. From this perspective, the pre-Hebrew worship of Yahweh becomes not a challenge to faith, but evidence that the divine was actively preparing humanity for a fuller understanding of spiritual truth. The Canaanite storm god, the Arabian sky deity, the Mesopotamian creator figure, all might be seen as partial revelations of the same divine reality that would eventually be more completely revealed through Hebrew prophecy and teaching. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more fascinating. The suppression of evidence about pre-Hebrew Yahweh worship wasn't entirely accidental. Throughout history, religious and political authorities had strong incentives to maintain the narrative that their particular tradition represented unique divine revelation, rather than the evolution of earlier religious concepts. During the period when Hebrew scriptures were being compiled and edited, likely during and after the Babylonian exile, Hebrew religious leaders were wrestling with profound questions about their national identity and their relationship to surrounding cultures. Emphasizing the unique character of their religious revelation helped distinguish Hebrew religion from the various other traditions competing for adherence in the cosmopolitan world of the Persian and later Greek empires. Early Jewish and Christian communities continued this pattern, often viewing any suggestion that their religious traditions had been influenced by pagan sources as a threat to the authenticity of their faith. By the time Islamic tradition began developing, the pattern was well established. Each monotheistic tradition claimed direct divine revelation rather than acknowledging the complex historical processes through which their understanding of the divine had actually developed. This pattern continued into the modern era, where archaeological discoveries that challenged traditional narratives were often greeted with suspicion or outright rejection by religious authorities. The Ugaritic tablets, despite their obvious scholarly importance, were rarely discussed in religious education, and their implications for understanding the development of monotheism were generally confined to academic circles. Even today, many people who consider themselves well-educated about religious history remain completely unaware that Yahweh was worshipped by non-Hebrew peoples centuries before Israel existed. This isn't necessarily due to deliberate deception, but rather to the natural human tendency to maintain familiar narratives rather than grappling with complex and potentially disturbing new information. Yet for those willing to engage with this evidence, it opens up remarkable new ways of understanding both religious history and contemporary faith. Rather than seeing the development of monotheism as a series of isolated divine interventions, we can begin to appreciate it as a gradual human discovery of profound spiritual truths. A discovery that involved multiple cultures and centuries of spiritual evolution. The story of pre-Hebrew Yahweh worship also sheds new light on some of the persistent puzzles in religious studies. Why do so many ancient cultures have flood narratives similar to the biblical account of Noah? Why do creation stories from different civilizations share remarkable similarities? Why do ethical teachings about justice, compassion, and human dignity appear across cultures that had no apparent contact with each other? If Yahweh, or the spiritual reality behind that name, was indeed working throughout human history and across different cultures, then these similarities become less mysterious. Instead of seeing them as evidence that religious traditions borrowed from each other, we might view them as evidence that humans throughout history have been encountering and responding to the same underlying spiritual reality, each in their own cultural context. This perspective doesn't necessarily require believing in any particular religious doctrine. Even from a purely naturalistic viewpoint, we might see the development of Yahweh worship as evidence of humanity's gradual ethical and spiritual evolution. Our growing understanding of concepts like justice, compassion, and human dignity that transcend tribal loyalties and cultural boundaries. The archaeological evidence certainly supports this evolutionary view. When we trace the worship of Yahweh from its earliest appearances in Ugaritic and Egyptian texts through its development in Hebrew religion and its eventual influence on Christianity and Islam, we see a clear progression of ethical sophistication and spiritual insight. The early Canaanite Yahweh was primarily a god of natural forces and tribal warfare. The Hebrew development of Yahweh worship added crucial elements of moral law and universal justice. Christian tradition emphasized divine love and personal relationship. Islamic tradition stressed divine unity and social responsibility. Each development built upon earlier foundations while adding new insights and applications. Understanding this progression doesn't require choosing between faith and historical scholarship. Many contemporary religious thinkers have found ways to embrace both the historical evidence about religious development and their own spiritual convictions about divine truth. They see the historical process not as undermining divine revelation, but as illuminating how divine truth becomes accessible to human understanding across cultures and centuries. What makes the story of pre-Hebrew Yahweh worship particularly compelling is how it illustrates this process in action. We can actually trace, through archaeological evidence and textual analysis, how spiritual concepts developed and spread across ancient Near Eastern cultures. We can see how different peoples contributed different insights to humanity's growing understanding of the divine. And we can appreciate how the Hebrew synthesis of these various traditions created something genuinely new and revolutionary, even while building on much older foundations. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the complex history behind Yahweh worship can help us approach contemporary religious diversity with greater wisdom and humility. If the development of what became Judaism, Christianity, and Islam involved learning from and building upon the insights of many different peoples and cultures, then perhaps our own spiritual growth might benefit from similar openness to truth wherever it might be found. The forgotten worship of Yahweh before Israel existed reminds us that the search for divine truth has always been a human endeavor that transcends cultural and ethnic boundaries. The Ugaritians who carved Yahweh's name into clay tablets, the Shasu who worshipped Yahweh in the southern deserts, the Hebrew prophets who proclaimed Yahweh's universal justice, the Christian apostles who declared Yahweh's love for all humanity, and the Islamic teachers who emphasized Yahweh's absolute unity. All were participating in the same great human quest to understand our relationship with the transcendent. Their stories interconnect in ways that are far more complex and beautiful than the simplified narratives we often inherit from our particular religious traditions. By understanding these interconnections, we don't diminish the significance of any particular faith tradition. Instead, we gain a deeper appreciation for the magnificent scope of human spiritual development and the persistent human longing for connection with something greater than ourselves. The clay tablets from Ugarit that startled archaeologists in 1929 were just the beginning. Every year, new discoveries add more pieces to this cosmic puzzle of human religious development. Ancient inscriptions from Arabia, newly deciphered texts from Mesopotamia, and sophisticated analysis of biblical manuscripts continue to reveal the incredibly rich cultural matrix from which monotheistic religion emerged. Each new discovery reinforces the same basic insight. The spiritual traditions that have shaped billions of lives developed through complex historical processes involving many different peoples and cultures. Understanding these processes doesn't undermine faith. It enriches it by revealing the incredible scope and persistence of humanity's search for transcendent truth. As we've explored this forgotten chapter of religious history, we've seen how the worship of Yahweh emerges from the myths of prehistory, appears in various forms among different ancient peoples, and gradually develops into the sophisticated theological traditions that continue to influence billions of people today. It's a story that combines archaeological detective work, linguistic analysis, and profound theological reflection into one of the most fascinating narratives in all of human history. The next time you hear the name Yahweh spoken in synagogue, church, or mosque, remember those ancient Ugaritic tablets and the remarkable journey that brought this divine name from the pantheon of ancient Canaan to the center of global religious consciousness. Remember the Shasu nomads worshiping their desert god, the Hebrew prophets transforming tribal religion into universal ethics, and the countless generations of believers who have found in this ancient name a source of meaning, purpose, and hope. If you found this journey into forgotten history as fascinating as I have, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could show your support with a super thanks. Creating content like this requires extensive research and countless hours of work, and every bit of support helps me continue excavating these hidden treasures of human history. Your contribution, no matter the size, makes a real difference in keeping Professor Archive alive and thriving. The story of pre-Hebrew Yahweh worship reminds us that truth is often stranger, more complex, and more wonderful than fiction. The real history of human spiritual development involves conspiracies and cover-ups, dramatic discoveries and shocking revelations, but it also involves the patient work of countless scholars, archaeologists, and truth seekers who have dedicated their lives to understanding where we came from and how we got here. Until next time, keep questioning, keep digging, and keep seeking the truth that lies buried beneath the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about our past. The archive of human history contains treasures beyond imagination. We just have to have the courage to look.